Hey, RetconRaider here. Today, we're continuing our analysis of the Van Buren documents by taking our first look at design document number 14, which covers the sinister ghoul-run settlement known as the Reservation. Now, as I've mentioned before, this document is the largest of the 15 leaked design documents. It provides us with roughly 80 pages worth of design notes for the location, though, as usual, it's padded out with a few pages worth of redundant information and empty space. The reservation was clearly intended to be about the same size as other locations such as Boulder Dome and Mesa Verde, but scaled to present the player with a much higher overall challenge. Like many of the other prominent locations in the game, it was also intended to be a mandatory part of the main storyline. This location not only held one of the prisoners that the player needed to collect during Act 1, but it also held a plot device that was required to complete the game. With a total of 5 sublocations, 15 named NPCs, and 17 prominent quests planned for this area, we have a lot of ground to cover. So, as usual, we'll be splitting our analysis up over multiple videos. Today, we'll be focusing on the lore and layout of the location, but we'll spend some more time talking about things like the NPCs and planned quest content over the next couple of videos. That said, let's get started. The reservation was first established in the year 1943. Originally known as the Los Alamos National Laboratory, it was the home of the Manhattan Project. In the decades following the end of World War II, the lab continued operation, conducting research in numerous fields including space exploration, nuclear fusion, and computer technology. By the year 2063, the facility was being led by 2 men, a top nuclear physicist named Dr. Willem Clark and a career soldier named Colonel Green. With the resource wars in full swing, the United States began developing orbital missile platforms, and in 2065, the Los Alamos Lab was ordered to begin designing and manufacturing nuclear missiles that could be fired from these orbital platforms. Research and design was completed by the year 2072, and over the next 5 years, the Los Alamos facility focused on manufacturing these special missiles. They were then shipped to various space centers so they could be taken into space and installed on the ballistic orbital missile bases that the US government had already put into orbit. Unfortunately, by October of 2076, the B.O.M.B project was put on indefinite hold due to budget cuts. B.O.M Station 1 and 2 were both already in orbit and were technically functional, but they were only partially complete and received less than half the nuclear missiles they were originally intended to carry. B.O.M Station 3 was left largely incomplete, with a few finished components being stored in a hangar at the Bloomfield Space Center. Production on the orbital missiles was cancelled, and the Los Alamos Lab was put in reserve. Then, 1 year later in October of 2077, the Great War took place. Multiple nuclear missiles impacted the Los Alamos area, devastating the above-ground structures and causing limited damage to the underground sublevels. Although several of the soldiers and scientists who were hiding in the sublevels were protected from the blast, radiation began seeping into sublevel 2. Now, according to the Mesa Verde design document, several scientists and soldiers actually survived on the surface level. Assuming that everyone else was dead, they gathered all the supplies they could carry, including sealed containers of weapons-grade uranium. They then left in search of a safer place to set up camp, eventually resettling in Mesa Verde National Park, leading to the creation of what would eventually be known as the Cipher Tribe. Unbeknownst to them, several of the other soldiers and scientists assigned to the facility, including both Dr. Willem Clark and Colonel Green, had actually survived. They spent a decade sealed in the lower levels of the facility, and during that time, the slow radiation leak on sublevel 2 steadily took its toll. By the year 2087, almost everyone in the facility had died of radiation poisoning, with the few survivors, including Clark and Green, instead being transformed into ghouls. Dr. Clark led a group of 11 other volunteers into the radioactive wastes, in hopes of discovering other survivors. In their absence, Colonel Green took command of the remaining survivors, secretly hoping that Dr. Clark would never return. However, Dr. Clark did return almost exactly 1 year later. All of the volunteers who had accompanied him had died during the expedition, but Clark had returned with numerous other ghouls he had encountered during his travels. This included his new bodyguard, Horatio, and his new right-hand man, a former plastic surgeon named Dr. Sebastian. Dr. Clark resumed his former leadership position, telling the other survivors about how ghouls were hated and persecuted across the rest of the post-nuclear landscape. He had become convinced that ghouls were the next logical step in mankind's natural evolution, and he promised to one day find a way to make the ghouls the true and rightful heirs to the promised Earth. Over the next 2 centuries, Dr. Clark essentially created a cult based entirely around his belief that ghouls were the superior species. Unfortunately, the biggest hurdle that ghouls were facing was their inability to reproduce. He spent decades trying to find a way to circumvent this limitation, but eventually conceded that all ghouls were naturally sterile. Not one to give up so easily, he instead began a new project with Dr. Sebastian in 2198, intent on finding another way to allow the species to procreate. By 2220, they were ready to begin human trials. The ghouls at the reservation began purchasing human slaves from the tribes around the Colorado area. The strongest and healthiest of these slaves were used as part of the ghoul procreation experiments, while the weaker slaves were instead forced to literally work themselves to death in other parts of the facility. These experiments had a 100% casualty rate among the human test subjects, but by July of 2227, Dr. Sebastian had managed to create the first of a new species, something which he called a born ghoul. Not only was this new breed of ghoul both faster and stronger, but it also possessed more symmetrical features and aged at a tremendously accelerated rate. Within 1 month of being born, this ghoul, named Measles due to the odd tumor-like growths on his neck, had reached full physical maturity. He was taken in as Dr. Clark's favored child and was practically worshipped by the rest of the doctor's followers. Encouraged by this success, Dr. Sebastian continued his experiments over the next few decades. Although these experiments continued to have a 100% fatality rate among the human test subjects, they also had a 2% success rate, with 3 additional born ghouls being successfully created over the following 26 years. By 2249, a more consistent and lucrative slave trading contract was established with Caesar's Legion, allowing the gruesome experiments to continue at an accelerated rate. Even after the bulk of the Legion withdrew from the Colorado area, they continued to make monthly deliveries to the reservation. Meanwhile, Dr. Clark was continuing his own grand plans to wage a war against mankind. Growing increasingly egotistical and reclusive over the years, he secluded himself to Sub-Level 3, which he only shared with his children, his hand-picked science staff, and their human test subjects. Under his orders, his research team built a massive howitzer-like cannon, which they dubbed Nuclear Nelly. This weapon was capable of launching specially made dirty bombs at targets up to 30 miles away. Dr. Clark hoped he could use this weapon to preemptively destroy nearby human settlements before they could someday pose a threat to the reservation. Fearing that some of his followers might object to such an extreme plan, Dr. Clark kept it a secret from everyone outside of his immediate inner circle. This would set the stage for the player's inevitable arrival in 2253, when they would walk into the middle of a slowly brewing power struggle between Dr. Clark and Colonel Green. From a design standpoint, the reservation was intended to be focused on function over form. The nuclear blasts devastated the surface structures during the Great War, and the ghouls never bothered trying to repair any of the damage. The majority of the surface level was instead transformed into a shanty town made of scrap metal and old military equipment, which was all set up around the bombed-out remains of collapsing hangars and office buildings. The reservation was split into 5 separate sub-locations: the trading post, the shanty town, and 3 sub-levels. All 5 of these sub-locations were laid out in a relatively linear fashion, with each successive location presenting increasingly difficult challenges for the player to overcome if they wanted to get to the next area. The location was designed to accommodate multiple approaches, including stealth, diplomacy, and even violence. The first sub-location, and the only area where the player would normally be allowed, was the trading post. This area was little more than a large open-air courtyard with 2 broken-down army trucks on one side and a large military tent on the other. The trading post was protected by a 10-foot-tall wall of scrap metal and 3 makeshift guard towers, each equipped with an old-fashioned hand-cranked Gatling gun. While most of the ghouls didn't care for humans, they understood the necessity of trading with them. To accommodate this, the 2 broken-down trucks were converted into makeshift stores, specializing in the sale of armor and weaponry that the ghouls manufactured on Sub-Level 2. The large military tent on the east side of the trading post was instead used to accommodate the local slave trade. Although it was a relatively small area, this sublocation featured several notable NPCs, including 3 ghoul merchants and a human slave who just happened to be one of the escapees from the Tibbetts prison facility. Depending on when the player visited this area, they could also end up encountering a centurion from Caesar's Legion or the leader of a very strange local tribe of scavengers. We'll spend some more time talking about them in the next video. The rest of the town was separated from the trading post by a large metal gate. Under normal circumstances, visitors weren't allowed to pass through this gate, but there were a few different ways for the player to gain access. Again, that's a subject for another video. Assuming the player did make it past the inner gate, then they would be able to enter the shanty town that most of the ghouls lived in. This area was a chaotic hodgepodge of partially collapsed pre-war structures, abandoned military vehicles, and improvised huts. Like the trading yard, this area also relied on natural cliffs and a 10-foot-tall wall of scrap metal for protection. Most of the buildings and equipment here were crumbling and barely functional, but still saw regular use by the town's ghoulish inhabitants. A crude but functional train engine, cobbled together from a wide assortment of parts, was located near the northern side of the settlement, but the tracks were in such poor condition that the train couldn't actually travel to any of the other nearby settlements. The elevator and cargo lift to the sublevels were located directly behind the train. Although this sublocation was much larger than the trading post, there really wasn't a lot for the player to do here. The majority of the NPCs were nameless guards or townsfolk, with a few exceptions. Most notably, this is where the player could first meet Colonel Green. Depending on how the player approached him, this would also be their first opportunity to work alongside the Colonel, which would make it much easier to access the restricted sublevels. Regardless of how the player gained access to Sublevel 1, they would discover it to be a relatively small but surprisingly clean and well-kept pre-war shelter. This area managed to avoid any significant damage during the Great War, and by 2253 it was being used to house the more important ghouls who helped with things like research and development. The layout here was fairly straightforward, consisting of little more than a hallway with an elevator on one end, locker rooms and a staff computer on the other end, and multiple sleeping quarters spaced along either side. Again, there wasn't a whole lot for the player to do here, but it would give the player the opportunity to steal some valuables or use the staff computer to gain a few clues about Dr. Clark's plans. This was also where the player could meet Marty, the ghoul chemist who had created Smooch, the dangerously addictive new chem that we talked about back in Part 3 of our Hoover Dam analysis. We'll spend some more time talking about him over the next couple of videos. It's also important to note that this is one of the few parts of the facility that was still relatively sealed, so it made a good place for the player to take shelter from the radiation that permeated almost every other area in and around the reservation. In fact, as one of the only places where a human could safely remove their environmental suit, one of the easiest ways to gain permission to enter this area was if the player happened to, build up a particularly intimate relationship with one of the higher-ranking ghouls. We'll come back to that in a future video as well. Now, before we move on, it's worth mentioning that the writer of this document, Damian Folletto, expresses repeated uncertainty over various elements of ghoul physiology. While he makes it clear that ghouls can still go through the motions of having sex, he confirms that they're basically sterile. He also states that ghouls are highly resistant to chems and poisons, implies that they don't need to eat or drink to survive, and repeatedly questions whether they even have to defecate at all. Mr. Folletto had never written for a Fallout game before, so it's possible that he was simply unfamiliar with the details of the setting. Still, it's very interesting to note that all of these details are things that ended up being integrated into the canon of the later Bethesda-made sequels. At any rate, the player could also use the staff elevator to reach Sublevel 2. This level also suffered damage during the Great War, and in stark contrast to Sublevel 1, it was in simply awful condition. This level was significantly larger than Sublevel 1, containing several different rooms including a chemical lab, armor and weaponsmithing facilities, a shooting range, the incinerator room, sleeping quarters, and some barely functional bathroom facilities for the human slaves. It's also important to note that this level had two elevators, one connected to the main shaft that led back up to the surface, and another that acted as the only currently functional entrance to Sublevel 3. That meant that if the player wanted to get into Sublevel 3, they would first have to pass through this dangerous and heavily guarded area. Although the facility possessed advanced chemical and mechanical labs, the majority of the manufacturing was done using much cruder equipment, such as makeshift anvils, coal-fueled furnaces, and expendable human slaves. This was also where Dr. Clark's assistants would incinerate the bodies of their dead test subjects. The thick toxic fumes and low but steady levels of radiation meant that the slaves forced to work on the manufacturing lines rarely survived for more than a few years. If the player ended up being allied with Dr. Clark or Colonel Green, then they would be allowed to use these facilities to manufacture various items. NPCs such as Marty and Milt the Foreman were intended to help the player make use of the equipment, assuming the player actually had permission to be there. That finally brings us to the nerve center of the reservation, Sublevel 3. Only accessible through an elevator leading up to Sublevel 2, this area was reserved exclusively for Dr. Clark, Dr. Sebastian, and their hand-picked elite, as well as the human slaves they were experimenting on. Much like Sublevel 1, Sublevel 3 was also very clean and well-kept, but it was also deliberately kept very dark and cold. Dr. Clark preferred the darkness, so much of the level's illumination came from red emergency lights and glowing force fields. Sneaking onto this level would be almost impossible because access required visual confirmation from Dr. Clark himself, but the player could theoretically get permission to access this level if they were working with Colonel Green or one of the born ghouls. This level included sleeping quarters for Dr. Clark and his elite, including all 4 of the born ghouls and his hand-picked science staff. It also included the gestation lab, which was unofficially referred to as the Green Room. This is where Dr. Sebastian carried out his hideous procreation experiments, a process that was apparently extremely invasive, extremely painful, and always fatal. Slaves brought to this level had essentially been given a death sentence. They would be kept in a filthy holding area until it was their turn to visit the Green Room. Then, once Dr. Sebastian was done with them, they would be disposed of in the incinerator room on Sublevel 2. Force fields were used to block off access to particularly important areas, such as the nuclear research lab, the reactor room, and Dr. Clark's private quarters. The born ghouls and the science staff carried keycards that could be used to bypass most of these force fields, but only Dr. Clark had a key to his private room. The force fields could also theoretically be disabled by a talented mechanic. Players who were intent on disabling the entire facility would likely make a beeline for the reactor room, but they would just be setting themselves up for disappointment. Given the likelihood that the facility would be attacked or sabotaged, the reactor room was built to minimize the chance of collateral damage. If the primary reactor was disabled, the facility would just switch over to backup power, and the room was so heavily insulated that even if the reactor exploded, it wouldn't inflict any significant damage on the surrounding rooms. The final room on Sublevel 3 was, of course, the Nuclear Research Lab, where the pre-war scientists once built the nuclear missiles that were destined for use on the B.O.M.B satellites. This area contained numerous items of note, including some disassembled or otherwise incomplete nuclear missiles, the facility's main computer, and Nuclear Nellie, the atomic howitzer that Dr. Clark was planning to use on neighboring settlements. This area also included a large cargo lift intended to transport things like missiles and artillery to the surface, but it was damaged during the Great War. Ultimately, Sublevel 3 was where the player would be able to meet with several of the reservation's most prominent NPCs, such as Dr. Willem Clark, Dr. Sebastian, and the 4 born ghouls, including Measles, who was a potential recruitable companion, and Belle, who was a potential romantic interest. This was also where the player would not only determine the final fate of the reservation, but it was also where they would find vital information that was required to finish the game's main storyline. Of course, that's a subject for another video. For now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, Although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out most of the leaked documents for yourself by visiting the fan-run Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.